We are on. Priyanka Taslim, thank you so much for coming to Hazawi podcast. Really appreciate you coming.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I thought to start with a very basic question about when did you start writing? When did you think about yourself as a writer?
So I've always had a love of books, and libraries were my sanctuary growing up. I loved going to the public library and visiting the school library. I don't think that I saw myself as a writer, however, until maybe I was about 12 years old. That's when I started to have this dream of seeing my own name on a book rather than just being a reader. And then around that time, I discovered the world of websites like fanfiction.net and Fiction Press, and Archive of Our Own came later, but LiveJournal and things like that. And so I started writing fan fiction first about some of my favorite fandoms at the time. I was like a big anime geek at the time, and I would write anime fanfics. And then that kind of branched out, and I started writing my own original works. But I didn't really take it very seriously until I went to college. And at that point, I decided that it was going to be a serious dream for me, something that I really wanted to pursue.
And did you study creative writing in college, or what was that turn for you?
So in college, I got my minor in creative writing, but I studied like a lot of, I'm sure, children of immigrants. My parents wanted me to have that reasonable career to fall back on. And for me, that was teaching and literature. So my majors were in literature with a certification in teaching, but I also got my creative writing minor at the time.
Yeah, I definitely relate to the immigrant experience of being in college and expected to major in like law or pre-med.
Yes.
Otherwise, it is not a valuable option to get creative writing or something around like social studies or whatever.
Yes.
Um, do you remember the first story that you wrote and you thought this is a story very different than the things that I wrote before, and what was it about?
So around the time that I was applying to high schools, I applied to this one school of arts as part of their writing component. And I remember I wrote this story at the time about these two, they were cyborgs or androids or something, and their names were Adam and Eve, but they were acronyms. And I made up this whole elaborate acronym for each of them and this dystopian world that they lived in. And that was the story that I submitted. And I remember showing it to some of my teachers at the time. And that was the first time I showed real people any of my non academic, non essay writing. And one of my teachers, he was actually a social studies teacher. He read it in the seventh grade. I think it was seventh and eighth grade. He was my social studies teacher. He read it and he said, "This is amazing, and you have talent. And if this is something that you want to pursue, you should do it." And I ended up not going to that performing arts school. Just they did accept me, but I didn't end up going because of logistics, like where it was. But I think that kind of embedded this little seed in me, hearing it for the first time from an adult, from a teacher, that I had this talent. My parents have been very supportive once they found out, but for a really long time, I kept it secret from them. So they didn't really have the opportunity to be encouraging about that. But that was a moment.
Um, what do you think? And this is not particular to the story that the first story you wrote in high school, or the story that you got recognition from an adult. It can be in general. What are the top three elements that makes a story works?
So for me, and I'd say this is true even to this day, the characters, if they're strong characters that you can relate to and they feel like real people leaping off a page, I think that that is one of the biggest strengths that a writer can have. And sometimes I'm willing to overlook if there are fallacies in the plot, as long as the characters are people that I can really root for and stay interested in. So I like to think that that's something that I have continued honing and strengthening. So I would say that that's probably the main thing for me, the characters, and then branching off of that, having you tied to it a voice that stands out. I think finding their own voice is something that writers struggle with at first, or even for a really long time. Even going from story to story, sometimes it's hard to find that voice. But once you find the thing that really makes you stand out and sound like yourself and have that be the thing that someone can pick up your next book and say, yes, that's a Priyanka Taslim book. That is something that's really important. And then I would say the plot is having an interesting or high concept plot is probably also important. But as I said, I'm willing to overlook that sometimes if the characters feel real and relatable.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the characters, and in this book that you wrote, The Love Match, there are many characters. It's not one character. We get Zara, who's the main character, and we follow her story. But also, we get all these side characters, and we also dive into their personal life. And Zahra sort of changes the trajectory of their lives because of her mere presence. How do you maintain and develop all of these things at once?
So I am definitely going to say it's a challenge. It's not easy to have a big cast. And I always, when I'm first writing a story, I always tell myself, why did you choose to do this and torture yourself with having to follow all of these plot threads? But I think it's worth it, simply because, at least for me, I grew up surrounded by a big community, a big family. And so it felt authentic to me to write stories where that's present. And I just think it makes a book more enjoyable when the characters who populate the story aren't flat and just there to prop up the protagonist, but have their own plot lines and lives going on. So since I started writing, I would always in the back of my mind, even for the most minor character, have something where I'm wondering, well, I wonder what this person's backstory is, because in every story throughout life, people see themselves as the main character. So if this person sees themselves as the main character, what do they think? What's their conflict? What is their history? What are they trying to overcome in the story? So I think that it pays off. It can be really difficult to do and take multiple drafts. But in the end, it always felt worth it to me to have all these characters and not just have it be Zara's story.
Yeah, I really like the tool that you mentioned of asking yourself questions about the particular character that you're trying to write and what their background and their challenges. Um, I had Sajda Ali in the previous episode, and we spoke about her journey to find an agent and get her first book published. And you have a very interesting story that I read in your website. I was hoping that you talked about that.
Oh, yes. So I think, especially if people only recently came to follow me, they might think that I had this relatively quick and painless journey. Like I just announced a second book yesterday that's been kind of brewing in the background for a long time, and I had comments from a lot of people saying, you're such a superstar. I can't believe you're managing all these things, and it didn't come to this point simply at all. So I started taking writing seriously again and pursuing it as a career once I had been a teacher for about at least a year. And at that point, I told myself, okay, Priyanka, you can only put it off for so long. It's time to get serious about this if you really want to do it. And I wrote this book that is in a completely different genre that would probably surprise people, seeing my young adult contemporary and women's fiction book deals that I write fantasy and science fiction as well. So I wrote this fantasy novel and I had no idea about publishing. I think that can actually be one of the things that prevents marginalized people in particular from breaking in, because we don't always have the resources. Sometimes authors who already have families entrenched in the industry, it's easy for them. They know what querying is, they know how to write a query letter. I didn't know any of that. So I wrote this book and started reading up on the background of these things without really knowing how any of it works. And one of the most embarrassing things I did is I pitched the book almost right away because I thought it's a good book. And some of my friends read it and they said it's okay. Friends in real life who aren't in the industry, they said it's a good book. So it must be a good book. And I pitched it. And that was one of the, I think, mistakes that I made at the time because it wasn't ready for that. And I soon came to learn that. From that experience, I found out that the book needed a lot of revision. I ended up revising it quite a bit over the next year. And I tried to get into several mentorship contests and finally managed to get into one. And I had to completely overhaul the book. So I completely rewrote the book. And that's what I ended up then querying. So once I began querying, because I had done that overhaul, I did notice that I was getting more of a response from agents, getting more full requests, getting more interest. And that did ultimately lead to me getting an agent. But um, even at the point that I was getting the agent, I was getting so many rejections too. So it's a lot of ups and downs when you're in this industry. And so once you get the agent, you kind of think, okay, this is it. There's nowhere to go but up, right? You're going to go on submission and sell the book right away, and that'll be that. And I never had the biggest expectations because, as a writer from a marginalized community, I had friends who would say, oh, I want to sign with the big four and I want to get a six-figure deal. I want to get this big deal. I just wanted to get published, like, no matter what happened. But sometimes your trajectory isn't so smooth. So I did manage to sign with a wonderful agent who I'm still with to this day. But she had feedback for me that did resonate. It was just that I had done so many recent revisions of this book and completely overhauled it to the point where I was struggling with revising this book. So I would say one thing that I learned from that experience, however, is my agent didn't immediately give up on me. She said, I can tell that you're really struggling with this revision. I can tell you're not ready to do this right now, and that's fine. Work on the next thing. Tell me what the next thing is that you want to write and work on that. So it was a blow because I love this book and I still think about it sometimes and I might go back to it someday. So it was hard to hear that no, we're not ready to go on submission right away. You need to keep working on the book or start working on something else. But I would say that that is a good sign when you're looking for an agent where they're worried about your overall career rather than just the one book. If you sign with an agent and the first book doesn't work out and you immediately notice a shift in the way that they treat you, that is a red flag for an agent. So that particular book never even ended up going on submission. I never had a chance to work on those revision ideas that she had. I still want to do that someday. And then in the meantime, what happened is I ended up writing another book. And it's another book that never went on submission. No one has seen this book except my agent. And in fact, I don't think I ever got the edit letter back for it because by that point, the ball was already kind of rolling for the love match. So what happened is I wrote this book over some time, and it was a challenge because it was the book that I was writing after my dream book at the time um, didn't have the result that I had hoped for it. Um, and then my agent had a personal crisis in her life, and she wasn't able to read the book right away. And I understood that. And so the book was on the back burner and the pandemic had not yet started, but the ball was starting to roll for it. It was early about January, I want to say January of 2020, when I first started working on the love match. Um, at that time, I thought I wrote these two complicated fantasy novels, and they're not going anywhere right now. And they're quite difficult to revise because there's so many threads to make a fantasy novel work. What I want to do right now is kind of try writing a contemporary novel, writing a novel that's very tropey and fun, and where the plot is maybe not so dark and escapist. Because for me, romance novels had become a sort of escape as well. And then the pandemic happened, and it kind of felt like fate. Everyone was escaping into joyful contemporary novels. So I just kept working on the love match, and the pandemic started in March of 2020. I sold the book in October of 2020. After that, it just kind of felt like fate that that was the thing to do. So quite a bit. When I first started the story, it wasn't even a contemporary romance, really. It was just a contemporary novel. It was a little bit more serious. But as I was working on it, I felt this connection between the characters, this romantic connection that I wanted to explore more. And my agent was actually the one who told me, you have a very funny voice and you should use that more. I think that that might help you kind of refine your audience and what your audience would find appealing. So then I thought, okay, let me try to write a romantic comedy. I don't know how funny I am actually, but let me try doing that. But even so, because it's a book with a love triangle, I flip flopped quite a bit about who was going to be the end game. And so, quite a lot of revisions ended up being about that too. I would sway too far in one direction and get told, okay, now it doesn't seem like it's fairly balanced. Everyone's going to guess what the end game is. And then I would try to reel it back and get told, well, now you kind of did the opposite thing. And now it doesn't feel like he should be the end game if if this other character is shining so much. So it was definitely a balancing act to figure out. And then what you talked about with the cast to make sure that every character came to life on the page. There was quite a bit of revision to be done with that too. Scenes that were added and cut. I revised it quite a bit. Definitely. I don't think I can. At some point, I lost track.
Yeah, I mean, with that many characters and the plot line is definitely something very hard to you know keep in mind all at once. What authors or books that you looked up to or try to emulate?
So when I was a fantasy author, my biggest inspiration was Sabat Tahir. And there were other authors as well, like Roshani Chokshi, that I found very inspiring just because they were able to break through this glass ceiling that had kept authors like us out. But I was also, and still am, a huge fan of Sandhya Menon, who wrote When Dimple Met Rishi, because that was one of the first times that I'd seen in a young adult novel a romantic comedy where not just the protagonist is a brown heroine, but her love interest is as well, because it always felt like um, you kind of had to concede in one way or the other, or have a centered white protagonist in some way in order for publishing to take any interest in you. So I was always and have always been a big fan of Sandhya Menon's Dimple verse novels. My good friend Adiba Jaigardar has been a big inspiration to me as well, because she was also one of the first Bangladeshi authors to break into traditional publishing. We actually started right around the same time. We were both seeking an agent at the same time when we met. Um, and now she is two books in with a third one coming out next month, and a fourth one in 2023. So she's just been a big source of inspiration to me and always there when I have questions, to kind of guide me along the path, which I think is important because, like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of barriers when you're a marginalized author. So to see authors who are willing to kind of bring the ladder down and help the next person up, that's always important. I've been very blessed with authors like that. The I asked Asian American and particularly South Asian American authors for blurbs, and everyone that I asked, even when they were busy with their own deadlines and schedules, they made the time to do that for me. So I'm very inspired by authors like Axio, Lila Lee, Jennifer Yen, Farah Haran, Farah Nazrishi, Nisha Sharma. These are all authors that were willing to blurb me. And I sent my request to them so nervously, like, I understand if you don't have time, but all of these women took time out of their busy schedules to read my book and give me this blurb. So I think that that's something really important and inspirational, and it's something that I want to continue doing for up and coming authors. I've had a lot of that. And of course, there's my friends who are not yet published that I find very inspiring too as they continue fighting for this journey. So I would say, yeah, there are a lot of authors who have inspired me over the years, and I think they'll continue to inspire me.
Yeah, the sense of community that you talk about is very hard to find. So, and this is something that I struggle with for a very, very long time. Maybe I'm still struggling with it. Definitely less so since I got an MFA, because it just naturally gave me the opportunity to be introduced to people who love writing and reading as myself. But how did you get to that point? For a young aspiring writer, how can they find that community where they can find support to improve their writing, get published, and go down that path?
It is definitely very, very challenging, and there are a lot of misses in addition to the hits where you actually have this chemistry with someone as a friend. Um, I know things are challenging on Twitter right now, but Twitter is what I use to build a lot of community. I mentioned trying to get into some pitch contests. Does it still exist now? Pitch Wars. I don't know if they got rid of it recently. I know there was something going on with that. But I met a lot of writing friends around the same time because they had also submitted to Pitch Wars. And even if they hadn't gotten in and I hadn't gotten in, we kind of got to know one another through the discussions that people were having. They were posting on the Pitch Wars tag. Um, I would say, particularly for marginalized writers trying to find people within their own communities or extended communities, take a look at things like that. Pitch Wars, PitMad, DV Pit is a big one. If you find an author an aspiring author like you, who is interested in the same things, like you look at their pitch and you think, wow, this is amazing, I want to read this someday, tell them and start building that community. Um, I did a lot to try to find that community early on. There were I forget what it's called now, CP Match. There were things like CP Match. I think I met Adiba Jaigardar through CP Match, which is to help you find a critique partner. I think the person who hosts it still does it to this day. Um, and I saw her pitch and I saw she was Bangladeshi. And I think what I commented under her pitch was, "Oh my gosh, another Bangladeshi, hi," or something like that, and it evolved into this friendship to this day. So I would say definitely kind of put yourself out there, but also guard yourself a little bit because I had some bad experiences as well. Um, so early on, try to figure out if it is a match or not. If somebody is, wants to connect with you in the same way. One way to do that is rather than getting overexcited and sending someone your whole book, um, send them a chapter or two, and you get a chapter or two, and see if you vibe with them and you vibe with their feedback. Because I've had incidences where I would send someone something and they would respond back with feedback that I found, microaggressive in some way. And I also had people who, um, a little while down the line, announced that they were publishing something that sounded a little bit like what I had shared with them. And those moments can always feel very vulnerable and awkward. So it's really hard. Just like making a friend as an adult is really hard, right? To this day, it's like, I don't know, how do people make new friends? How do they make new connections? It's similar in the writing community. But if you put yourself out there and you let yourself be a little vulnerable um, while still not putting it all out there, I think, eventually it becomes easier. Um, and people can recognize genuineness too, I think. So if you are constantly under someone's comments because you want something from them, or, they're a little bit up ahead of you, and you're constantly seeming to ask them for things, they might assume that you don't want that genuine friendship or connection. You just want to kind of benefit yourself in some way. That's easy to tell too. But I have friends who I have been friends with for a really long time, and it's just been an honor and a pleasure, whether they're above me or still trying to make it up to the level of having an agent or getting a publishing deal, to see them work at it and stay genuine people the whole time.
Yeah, this conversation about being genuine, and also you mentioned earlier the two-way relationship, that you're not just like getting, and I definitely found that early on, especially when I was in college. Professors who I saw as mentors, I found myself in a position where I used to take and not have any opportunity to give. They were way ahead of me in their career. I didn't have anything to offer. But when it comes to writers, you're always wanting someone to read your work, to give you critiques on particular pieces. So that's very helpful to like keep in mind of offer as much as you also want to gain. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the book. I did find it very joyful to read. It was very easy to get through. The characters were definitely appealing. Zahra is in this very what I found the funniest thing about it is the community, or like the aunties who have a network and WhatsApp groups. Um, because I feel like we have that as well in our like Yemeni community. Can you talk about that, and how did you introduce that in the book? Like, when did it come up to be in the book?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I'm really glad that you enjoyed the book. That was one of my favorite parts to write as well. The Auntie Network, who are constantly watching and having their own private conversations throughout the story that Zara is not aware of. Um, I wanted to include that element because like I said, well, I haven't mentioned this yet, but I set the book in my hometown of Paterson, New Jersey, and I wanted to do that because I had never read another book by a diaspora author that kind of explored what it's like to be like in this microcosm of your culture. I'd read a lot of books about what it felt like to kind of be tokenized by majority culture, because maybe you were upper middle class and you went to school with a lot of people who are white or whatever else may be the case. And by virtue of having it be set in Paterson, New Jersey, I had to include the aunties because I love them, but I have also experienced what it's like to kind of be under their ever present watchful eye, and kind of always have that in the back of your mind of, if I go out right now, who is going to see and how is that going to be taken, and who will that be reported back to? And to kind of always have this idea of just have that in the back of my mind and know, if somebody sees me in some particular place, even if it's innocent, whatever it might be, how they're going to take that and how that might be reported back. But I also wanted to subvert, um, because I think oftentimes older women in our communities are written as like tiger moms and kind of vilified. And there's always, I mean, everyone's experience is their own, but there's always more nuance to that. So even Zara's mom, she was one of my favorite characters to write, and she was a lot, but she was fun to write because of that. Um, I instilled some of what I noticed with my own parents with her, where she is pushing Zara in certain ways, but I can kind of see her side of the story too. Like I mentioned earlier, everyone sees themselves as the main character and the hero. So for her, seeing herself as the hero, it's to make sure that her daughter doesn't have to repeat these same cycles. And that is what motivates her to say the things that she does. And I think that's somewhat similar with the aunties, where they kind of mean well in some ways, and then in other ways they don't. So it was just fun to have them there as this, I like this Greek chorus in the background.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated that nuance, because I feel like it's so easy to just write someone that's evil and that are not like um like three-dimensional when it comes to writing characters. Even because that community of aunties did feel at times that they were meaning good. Overall, yes, they can be daunting, but at the same time, Zahara's understanding of where they come from, how they operate in the community was very, very sort of warm at times to read about, and like super funny. I thought that was the funniest thing in the book. You mentioned that that was a very fun part to write. What was the hardest part to write in this book?
Uh, so definitely some of the more emotional conversations that come up because I know that they are loaded moments. I definitely had to comb through them multiple times and make sure that the beats were on point, the dialogue was on point. That was a place where my editor said, you can bring out more emotion here, or it's just a little bit too clean to feel like a real argument. Um, and I had to deepen the feelings and the actions that were happening there and kind of show more than tell what was going on. So I think in moments like those, it's easy to kind of pull back, but those are the moments where you should really put it all out on the page. So those moments were tougher to write. And as I said, I flip flopped multiple times between choosing the boys, which was a good thing because I think it makes it difficult for the readers to choose sometimes too. So I would say that too. So I didn't always know when to go all in with one character or pull back a little bit to to make that end game feel more palatable by the time readers reached it.
Yeah, it's definitely a perplexing experience, and very rewarding, I'll say. Um, I wanted to ask you about something that you mentioned earlier, that you are a teacher. You still teach, is that right?
Yes, I've taught for 7 years now. So yeah, I've been teaching for a long time.
And what do you teach?
English ninth grade.
So how do you balance your writing and the amount of revision that you do, and also teaching? And teaching isn't, I have many friends who are teachers, and I have a day job from 9 to 5. After I clock out, I'm out. But they seem to carry some of that work back to their place. How do you balance both work and writing?
So definitely my colleagues who are teachers, I think they're doing some of the hardest and most challenging work in the world, because you really play multiple roles as a teacher. You're a therapist, you're a parent, you're an educator, you're a disciplinarian, you're all these things all at once. And it can be really hard to, as you said, leave that at school when you come home. I was fortunate when I was working on the majority of the love match because I was teaching from home for the first time, because of the pandemic. So I think that did help a lot. But then in 2021, when we went back into the school building, the 2021 school year, it was deeply challenging for me. I was working on my second book, the one that just announced yesterday, and I was had never struggled that much with a book before, because I mentioned earlier that for me, characters are a really big part of the story. And so I kind of immerse myself in the story and getting to know them and their world. And I constantly had to pull back from that new story because I was asked to do revisions for the love match. It's time for another revision. It's time to do copy edits. It's time to do this and that. And some people are really good at juggling multiple projects. I discovered then that I was not. So I was very, very burnt out at the time. Um, I don't know if I have a perfect answer for it because I think I'm still figuring it out. And I don't know if teaching is something I can do long term because of that. But I would say I write in the times that you can get, the little scraps of time that you can get, and try not to beat yourself up when you're not able to write every day. Some people give as recommendations to write. Make sure you write 500 words a day, 1,000 words a day. It's not always possible to do that. A lot of the love match and any other book I've worked on was written during weekends. Was written when I had my lunch break, or when I had one day where I could manage to put off grading for a little bit and just work on the book because I wasn't in the mood to do that, or whatever else might be the case. Was written on my phone sometimes. Um, So I would say that's one thing, to make sure not to punish yourself if you're not able to juggle everything. It can be hard, and I felt really guilty to ask for extensions. At that point, before I had any publishing deals, I could kind of write at my own pace, and my agent didn't really mind. I still felt the pressure to please her, and to make sure not to send her things late, but it was easier to do. But as you get further in your career and you have multiple deadlines, sometimes that's hard to do. So don't beat yourself up, and ask for an extension if you need to. It's better to let your publishing team know where you're at than struggle, because they can maybe find some room in a schedule, or even bump you sometimes. If it has to happen, it has to happen. I personally feel that I would rather be proud of the book than have it come out immediately after, or whatever else might be the case. And then the other thing is to make sure to rest, because it can be hard. Like I said, there's a lot of guilt, particularly when you're a marginalized author who's made it in. You feel like um, this opportunity, you don't want to waste it. But if you burn yourself out, there's no way that you can get out of that hole. So I had to really stop and take a rest and ask for those extensions to make that second book possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. And I'm trying to learn from that and be better, and just, I want this to be a long term career. And I think the way to do that is to make sure not to burn the candle out too quick at both ends.
Yeah, that was very inspirational. I definitely have. This is something that we talk about a lot in my writing group. Whether you set goals, daily word goals, 500 words, 1,000 words, or is it a particular time, from 9 to 10, and that's all I'm gonna write. Whether I write, 200 words or like three. So that was very inspirational to, forgive yourself, give yourself time to write, and when it's not done, then you don't beat yourself over it. What advice would you give your younger self, from, when it comes to your writing career?
So, for a really long time, I thought that I would have to have white characters to even get published. And it wasn't until college that, and later in college too, that I finally started writing characters that at all resembled my identity. And I think sometimes I struggle to finish my original projects because there was this lack of connection to the words. I'm a firm proponent of authors of color writing whatever they want. So that's fine. But for me personally, it was a real struggle to connect with my projects because I didn't always relate to what I was writing about, with the characters' lives if they were white. Um, so I would say, I would tell my younger self, like, you are going to get published someday, and it's going to be with books about Bangladeshi characters. You don't have to write them as like the funny side character in the background. They can be main characters. That's one thing. I think, honestly, for my younger self, that was the biggest thing. I never thought that publishing was possible because of my identity. Um, I'd grown up with people telling me that they didn't even know Bangladesh existed as a place. They would tell me, I've heard of India and maybe Pakistan. Have never heard of Bangladesh. Are you sure that's a real place? Or, in America, when people hear Asian, they often think East Asian, not West Asian or South Asian or anybody else. And so I would get told, you're not Asian, you're Indian, or whatever else might be the case. So I had big identity crises over time, with even coming to love and accept my culture. And that's why too I have this kind of warmth in the story, that Zara has this affection for it even when she's exasperated by it, because that's where my journey eventually took me, and it was hard to get there, and I don't want that to be the case anymore for younger writers coming up, or just young readers coming up, for them to be able to see representation and feel like, um, it's okay to be what I am, and it's not embarrassing, and I don't have to conform to make things happen. So I would say that's probably the bigger thing. And then of course there's little crafted advice that I could give myself, but I feel like she would eventually learn that on her own. It was the other part that it took her a long time to come to accept.
I want to get back to the craft part. When was the turning point for you when it came to, appreciating characters that come from, a Bangladeshi background?
So the first time I wrote a really Bangladeshi character was in college during my creative writing class. I was writing primarily white cast, as I said, or just being very, very vague if I did have a character of color at all within the text. And my professor at the time told me, you have talent, you have a great way with voice, but I'm not sure why you're not writing anything about your own culture. I feel like that would be interesting. And at the time, I was a little bit offended because for him, it's interesting. For me, it's my life. And I didn't like the idea of him saying that I had to capitalize on it. Um, but when I started writing those sorts of books, as I said, it resonated with me in a way that I had never experienced before with my previous original stories. I think fan fiction was different because, when you're watching, for example, um, I don't even know what's popular right now because I'm not in that world anymore. But like, let's say a Star Trek fan fiction or Star Wars, right? That's super popular right now, and a lot of people write it. When you're watching like Star Wars, obviously you're going to come to love Luke Skywalker or whoever might be the character. And so you feel that connection with them. You already saw their story play out. So I found fan fiction very easy to write, and not so easy to latch on to when I was making up my own characters. They felt very two dimensional. So I did write those stories for him because I wanted an A in the class. But once I started writing it, I thought this resonates with me in a way that hasn't happened before. So I'm going to see what happens if I do that. Oh, I will say, before I started writing my first book that got signed with an agent, that was one of the first projects that I actually managed to finish, but it took a lot of revision. So it wasn't, it didn't directly go to an agent. That was the first time I actually saw a traditionally published book by a big four publishing house with a Bangladeshi character. And that book was The Gauntlet by Karuna Riazi. And I think that too was kind of the switch because I already knew at that point that I wanted to write Bangladeshi characters, but that was the moment where I thought it's possible to both write them and to maybe even have that book go somewhere rather than it kind of being this impossible dream. So those were definitely factors.
Yeah. Um, I there are not many like fiction books that are written about Yemeni characters, different like Arab from different like national background. But I remember reading one that was about it was a nonfiction book. It's called I think The Monk of Mocha by Dave Eggers, and it was about this Yemeni guy who goes back to Yemen and starts this coffee company. And I remember after reading that, and it was I think after college feeling for the first time that I see myself in a in a character and I relate to him in a way that I've never felt that before. So it totally makes sense. You mentioned craft and like the development of your craft. Were there books early on that helped you with recognizing how to see craft as a form and how to like be able to manipulate it for the advancement of your character's story? Or was it just a process of revision?
So I would say definitely a little bit of both. I have I have always been drawn to stories. And so sometimes it's hard for me to read nonfiction and stay engaged in it. So what I would do is I would read a lot of pieces from Writer's Digest. Whenever I wasn't in the mood to work on something that I was writing, I would print out or just pull it up on my phone and read a piece from Writer's Digest. I would highlight the things that they talked about. But there were other books as well. There's the Save the Cat. I can't remember the author right now, but the Save the Cat. book that talks about how to plot your novel. It's adapted from screenplays, which I think can also be a good way to start because screenplays to give you the bare basics, the bare bones of a story, and then you fill in. So that taught me a little bit about plot. And I haven't had time to do much reading at all recently. I or when I do read, it's like advanced reader copies of colleagues' books that are publishing soon. So I haven't had a chance to really read any craft novels recently, but things like that definitely help me. So I would say there's a lot of podcasts and websites that recommend different craft novels. And then the Writer's Digest articles are free, if I recall correctly. They were free at the time when I was doing that. So to look up little things like that and just take the time whenever you have it to read them, because you can definitely learn from them. They're not always right, especially if it's somebody from a majority culture writing about it. I remember reading one craft piece where someone white was talking about how to incorporate characters of color. And I didn't agree with a lot of what I read in that particular one. So there will be hits and misses. You should definitely know that if something doesn't resonate with you, maybe it's not right for you. Um, I personally am of the belief that no writing advice is universal. There's always going to be an outlier who kind of makes it work. So um, if you really feel like something doesn't resonate with you, then you don't have to follow that advice, even if it is the traditional advice. But you also kind of have to be self aware and ask yourself, is it my ego that's saying I'm going to be the exception to write a $200,000, not a dollar, that would be nice though, right? Wouldn't it? 200,000 word debut novel and still have that sell? Or is it something that I truly believe in and know? And you have to compromise too throughout the process because I would say even if my name is on the cover, there were a lot of people that were involved. So yeah, it was a combination of things. There were some craft things that I looked at. I'd like to take some time to read more. The other thing is going back to what we talked about earlier, where you kind of put yourself out there and make a community. Reading and CPing books can actually teach you a lot about yourself and your own writing. Because by seeing it's sometimes easier to see the mistakes in someone else's work or the strengths in someone else's work because it's objective, whereas you have a lot of emotional connection to your own work. So you could read someone else's book and say, oh, I really like how they incorporated this way to describe a scene or whatever else might be the case. And I can do that too. And then you can transfer that over. Or you might see some glaring issue that you do too, and it makes you realize like, oh, this is bothering me as a reader, so I should fix it as a writer. So that's a good way to increase your skills as well. Once you make that community, to not just ask people to read your work, but to volunteer to read their work as well, and see what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and see how that can apply to your own writing.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was very helpful. What advice would you give before I let you go? What advice would you give for young aspiring writers?
So definitely to this is going to sound so cheesy because everybody says it, right? But I really think that if writing is your dream and it's something that brings you joy and it's something you constantly come back to, because that's the case for me, where I might stop for a while, but even when I was severely burnt out in my head, there's little ideas rolling. If it brings you that sort of joy, to not give up on it. You can take breaks, especially because querying can be so disenchanting and depressing, honestly. I would say querying is probably more depressing than any other stage. Going on submission is hard, but querying is depressing in its own way because you're kind of alone in it. Whereas when you're on submission, you have your agent. There's that one person who already believed in you by your side. So definitely keep fighting for your dream if it is your dream, but also that it's okay to take breaks. And I say this especially for marginalized writers because I know it's so easy to give up. Um, we don't see a lot of ourselves reflected back. There's a lot of windows of looking into other people's lives. There's not many mirrors, which is why every mirror there is important. So definitely do a lot of that. Read a lot, which is another cliche bit of advice, but when I'm burnt out sometimes and I pick up a good book, there's something so inspiring about seeing that that makes me want to write too, even if it's a completely different book. Um, Read outside your genre sometimes. People tend to see romance novels as lesser sometimes. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. It is a predominantly women dominated field. But I think romance authors have this great strength with character and relationships that you don't always see in other kinds of books. So if you are a fantasy writer, even and you pick up a romance novel, you could learn something from that.
Mm.
And the same is true in reverse. Um, I took what I learned as a fantasy author about world building, and I tried to kind of apply that to the love match in making the setting kind of feel like its own sort of character. I really wanted readers to be able to feel my love for my hometown within the book. And I think that was only possible because of the time that I spent as a fantasy author learning about how to build and flesh out this world and not just the dynamics within it. So definitely read a lot, keep pursuing your goals, take breaks if needed.
Well, Priyanka, thank you so much for coming on again. This was a very fruitful conversation to have with you. The Love Match, when is it out? How can people, where can people find it? How can people reach out to you, find you on the web?
So the Love Match is releasing January 3rd, 2023 in the US, and I believe March 2nd in the UK and extended territories. And I'm excited for people to see that cover because it's completely different.
Mm.
Um, so I am available on social media in many places. With my username's a bit funny because I had it before. I'm gonna put it in the chat, and then you can. I don't know if you edit it in or whatever might be the
I'll
case.
definitely link it.
Okay, so I'm Boot Babe on most social media. And the reason for that is because I like Bengali folklore related to spooky things,
Mm.
which is why I wanted to be a fantasy author at one point as well. So definitely if you search Priyanka Taslim, you can find me in various places. And thank you so much, Hamid, for having me. Um,
Yeah, thank
because
you.
this was a lovely interview.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.